Thank you for joining us, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. We're thrilled to be launching today a report that takes a really deep dive look at how Beijing uses inducements as a tool of economic statecraft, and particularly to lure Taiwan's diplomatic partners into switching their recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. I'm absolutely thrilled and really excited that we have with us today Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy. He was elected to Congress in 2016 and is now in his fourth term representing Illinois' 8th district. He serves as ranking member of the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, making him the first South Asian American in history to lead a congressional committee. He also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. And what's really exciting for me as a China watcher and a Taiwan supporter is he plays a really important leading role in Congress on bipartisan initiative to support Taiwan. That includes he was a lead for the Taiwan Allies Fund Act and also for the US-Taiwan Double Taxation Relief Act. So Congressman, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll first turn to you for some opening remarks, and then afterwards we'll have a fabulous panel discussion with a group of experts that will take us more into the weeds on this issue. Congressman, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And I wish I could be in the weeds with you later, but I have to jump for House business after my remarks. But I just want to say a big thank you to the Atlantic Council. Thank you to all of the guests and to, of course, the panelists who are really going to enlighten the group as to the latest issues confronting us, especially with regard to Taiwan. So I'm Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy of the 8th District of Illinois. I'm also the ranking member on the House Select Committee on the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And I want to thank again the Atlantic Council for hosting this very important conversation about Taiwan's international space and how the CCP seeks to constantly erode it. I want to make 3 points about this situation. First, the CCP's campaign to buy off Taiwan's partners is a delicate but deliberate and dangerous effort to harm democracy and development around the world. As we'll hear from this panel's experts, it's not only Taiwan's official partners, but its unofficial friends that face economic coercion by the CCP. From Palau to Paraguay, from Lithuania to even here in the United States, Beijing is waging diplomatic war against those who stand with Taiwan. Since 2013, the PRC has persuaded 11 countries to sever official relations with Taiwan, often through economic coercion and opaque agreements. In the Pacific, nations like the Solomon Islands and Kiribati have shifted allegiances following promises made by Beijing. Most recently, despite significant financial support from Taiwan, Nauru established ties with the PRC following Taiwan's presidential election, signaling Beijing's intent to punish Taiwan's democratic choices. This cannot continue to happen until those who recognize Taiwan become zero, which is what Beijing wants. Second, given this threat, the United States has to do everything in its power to protect Taiwan's rightful international place. Taiwan isn't just a valuable global partner, it's a beacon of freedom and democracy too. Taiwan contributes significantly to public health, technology, and economic development. The U.S. must do everything it can to advocate for Taiwan's inclusion in international forums and collaborate on development projects that reflect our shared values of transparency, sustainability, and mutual respect. What contrasts our approach from Beijing's is that while they seek opportunities to extract concessions, the U.S. works to provide development, progress, and opportunities for global community and collaboration. Third, there's an important and necessary role for Congress to fill to achieve these goals. For this reason, it's why I plan on reintroducing the bipartisan, bicameral Taiwan Allies Fund Act in the very near future. The aim is simple: support meaningful, sustainable development projects that deepen international security and welcome Taiwan into international cooperation efforts for peace and security. Specifically, it authorizes key development aid to countries that have official or strong unofficial relations with Taiwan. By supporting countries susceptible to CCP pressure because of their relations with Taiwan, this bill pushes against the CCP's illegitimate claim that Taiwan cannot play a role in the international community. This bill not only upholds Taiwan's international space, but also promotes a global environment where nations can make sovereign decisions free from coercion. The Trump administration's cuts to foreign aid and the dismantling of USAID are outrageous, dangerous, and self-sabotaging. We must be stepping up our global position, not kneecapping ourselves. The CCP is exponentially more active in extracting political gains from the developing world. Now is not the time for the U.S. to retreat. I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to address you. This particular introduction of the Taiwan Allies Funds Act is going to be bipartisan and bicameral. So please look for it, and it will be, I think, hopefully a bill that also can become law in this Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. We all really appreciate your leadership on this issue. And I have to say, to see something that is both bipartisan and bicameral is really exciting. And it really underscores the breadth of political support for this and your leadership particularly. So thank you for that. I know you have to run and go do congressional business. We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So I'll now bring in our really terrific panel of experts that are joining us today to discuss this issue in depth. I'll introduce them first. I have some questions for them stored up already, and we welcome the audience to ask questions as well. You can do so by going to askac.org, and we'll definitely get to those at the end of the discussion, but if some are really relevant to what we're saying in the moment, we might weave them in as we go as well. So please go to askac.org, and we very much welcome your questions. Terrific panel today. We have Gervasio Xu, Director of the Political Division at the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States, or TECRO. Gervasio is a career diplomat. Before he joined TECRO here in DC, he was the section chief at the Department of Latin American and Caribbean Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And before that, he was posted in Mexico and Paraguay. So really just the right expertise for this particular issue. We have Peter Mattis, president of the Jamestown Foundation, deep China hands that's respected across DC. He started his current position in fall 2023. Before that, he was Senior Fellow in the U.S. House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the CCP. He served at the Congressional Executive Commission on China and many other deep China positions, including in the IC. We have also Margaret Myers, Managing Director at the Johns Hopkins SAIS Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs. Margaret is also Senior Advisor to the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue and serves other positions as well, including as a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I think Margaret knows more than anyone else I know of in DC about China and Latin America. So this is just a really terrific group. So to get us started, Peter, if I could turn to you, Congressman Krishnamurthy mentioned that Beijing won't stop until it's peeled off all of Taiwan's diplomatic partners. I've read the report already, and the amount of money that Beijing is laying out to make some of these flips is truly impressive. So I wanted to go to you first to ask, what's in it for China? What are China's strategic aims here? And before I do that, I should also mention that the terrific author of this report, William Pecos, cannot join the panel because he has just been stolen away to go work on the Hill. He's now in the Congressional Research Service, where he's covering these and other issues for the U.S. Congress. So due to his current role, he's not joining us in the discussion, but we deeply appreciate his great work on this. And I'm glad that he is where he is now, because as you just heard, Congress can use his expertise. Peter, over to you on the China side.
First, Melanie, thank you for having me, and congratulations to William Picos for what is really a fantastically detailed report. And I think it's rare to see something with that many case studies, that well structured, that sort of clearly lay out what Beijing is doing and how they've been able to engineer a lot of these shifts in the way that countries either recognize Taiwan or recognize the People's Republic of China. I think the answer to your question starts with the fact that this is bigger than just Taiwan, right? The CCP's ambitions have always been global. That when you look at the way that Mao Zedong framed things, the way that Deng Xiaoping framed things, the way that every CCP leader up to the present has, they've always framed the position of the PRC on a global scale, right? To be a little bit flippant about it, the Great Leap Forward and all of the human harm that was caused by this was not about becoming Asia's largest steel producer. It was about becoming the world's largest steel producer. And just because they failed then didn't mean that they didn't eventually reach those goals in the 1990s. So I think it's something to recognize that even where there are setbacks, even where Taiwan flips countries back and Beijing goes after them again, that this is something that has kind of a continuous pressure underneath it. And that's the party's ambitions of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And part of that is, yes, the unification with Taiwan, right? And what you can see in this is about the diplomatic isolation, the economic isolation, and hopefully, in Beijing's eyes, leading to the annexation of Taiwan. I think it's worth keeping that in mind. The second element of this that's worth on the global ambition side is I think you're one of the first and only people in DC to cover the community of common destiny for humanity, is that it is an effort to create a new type of international relations, as Beijing calls it, and to recreate the way in which the world works and flows. And that's why you see the emphasis on infrastructure projects, because this allows Beijing to put pressure on trade flows, to redirect them, to suggest who has access and who does not to the world's logistics networks, who has priorities and who does not. And it helps, in a sense, recreate the PRC's domestic system where everything runs through the party on a global scale. And when you look at the words about partnerships, advice, the same words that are used to govern the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or sort of domestic United Front work, are used for this global network. And as it relates to Taiwan, it's not just about flipping the diplomatic partners, but as we've seen in the last year, there's been a very aggressive effort to get countries that recognize the PRC and not Taiwan to support all efforts at unification, not simply peaceful ones, but all efforts. And I think we're now up to roughly 70 countries, mostly in what we call the global South, although perhaps inaccurately in this case, to put that together. So it is about Taiwan, but it is also much bigger, and it goes into these other ambitions.
That's incredibly helpful. Margaret, you have really deep expertise in Latin America and the Caribbean. Honduras was one of the recent flips from 2023. Taiwan has 12 remaining partners, and of those, 7 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I thought some of Will's case studies on those countries were really great. He went into detail not only on the flips that we've had since 2016, but also on some of the remaining partners and what they're trying to balance. Can you share, from a Latin American perspective, Peter said, this is from Beijing's perspective, an attempt to recreate China's model on a global scale such that all runs through Beijing and all runs through the Chinese Communist Party. On the one hand, if I'm a leader in Latin America, that doesn't sound very attractive. On the other hand, they are offering a lot of cash as part of the deal, as Will went into such great depth on the report. Can you help us understand, when Latin American countries are making these decisions about how to align themselves, what is that like? What are they weighing and how do they approach that?
Yeah, well, thank you, Melanie. This was, by the way, for those who are listening, an absolutely fascinating report to read. So I hope you will engage with it. Um, it's been a really interesting sort of development over time in the Latin American context. This has been a stronghold for Taiwan for a matter of decades, and sort of country by country, we've seen. Especially in Central America, right, which was the primary sub-region in which there were so many Taiwan allies originally, right? Paraguay remains an ally, the only one in South America, and then the Caribbean also is a really critical, sub-region where there are several Taiwan allies remaining. And within the Central American context in particular, we've seen a number of countries decide to cut ties with Taiwan and establish them with the PRC. The rationale across the board has been, primarily economic in nature. Big expectations, right? Big expectations of trade agreements that would be transformative from an economic perspective, right? Big expectations for large scale infrastructure. Just a sense that aligning with China, which everyone knows to be a major economic power, right, would do much to promote growth, economic growth, and to, in many cases, sort of, generate progress, especially on projects that are of particular interest to governments that are looking to deliver for their populations during a very specific and sometimes short time frame. Has that happened is a really critical question, right? In many cases, the things that were expected have not materialized, right? I think El Salvador is kind of a really interesting case here, and this is one that was covered in the paper where there were big promises made by Chinese companies, right, and the Chinese government by extension when El Salvador decided to cut ties with Taiwan, and there have been projects that have materialized, but many of them are these sort of very symbolic pet projects that are reminiscent of China-Taiwan dollar diplomacy type competition that we saw, a couple of decades ago and even more. Not large-scale infrastructure or transformative projects, right, that will have major economic and long-lasting developmental benefits. The library, for example, is one which has very few books, as I understand it, but a lot of memorabilia. Another is a sort of rejuvenation project along the coast, sort of creating an area where there is sort of a recreational opportunity. And so there are things that are happening, but they're not nearly of the scale or of the level of impact, that many have anticipated. Dams in Honduras were part of the reason that Honduras decided to cut ties, and those have yet to materialize as well. And part of this is because China's simply not in the position to deliver some of this large infrastructure that it's delivered in the past, right? It's also learned some lessons having engaged with countries on large infrastructure projects and having those turn out not in ways that have been beneficial from an operational or reputational perspective. So there are a lot of reasons why this isn't happening, but that's a critical question. And just, beyond this, and Peter made such a really important point. And certainly China is engaging with countries, based on this notion that it has much to bring to bear, right, in support of their development, should they decide to align diplomatically with the PRC, whether that happens or not. And there are a lot of different ways, as outlined in this paper, that this is done, right? There are a lot of different avenues and mechanisms through which to engage with wide-ranging stakeholders, right, in pursuit of these objectives. But it's not just the Taiwan allies that China is engaging in Latin America. It's everyone else too. And just as Peter mentioned, there are these dependencies that are developing, in Central America certainly, and in the Caribbean, but across the entirety of the region that ensure, wherein China is the major trade partner for these countries, right, in many cases, but also a top investor in sectors that these countries deem critical to their own economic development. And it's a dependency that ensures that, very few are willing to rock the boat on issues of concern to China, and that includes, as concerns Taiwan, certainly, right, but also, just as Peter mentioned, on kind of the approach that China might take, to reunification, whatever that might look like. And so this is a bigger issue. It's a regional issue, and it goes beyond just this question of who will cut ties and who will not, inevitably.
That's a really great point. So diplomatic ties are a metric that we pay really close attention to for good reasons, but we shouldn't overlook that there's a lot of action beyond the flips and those specific decisions. Gervasio, over to you. Can you share, from Taiwan's perspective, how do you view your diplomatic partners? What's the geopolitical consequence when you see nations flipping recognition, when you see Beijing putting some wins on the scoreboard there? And how does that impact, Taiwan's place in the world and strategy, and how the people in Taiwan feel, how secure they feel?
Thank you, Melanie. I think, first of all, let me express our sincere gratitude for this invitation. I think I've read the whole report. I think I would also encourage all of the audience to take a look at the report. And I think there are a lot of concrete examples on how PRC is using every way to lure our diplomatic allies away from us. And but first of all, I would offer two set of ideas on how we look at the issue of our diplomatic allies. And I think first of all, of course, I think Peter and Margaret have clearly indicated that it's a way for it's a very important part of PRC strategy to isolate Taiwan from the international space. I think there are many ways that the PRC wanted to isolate Taiwan. I think keeping Taiwan with no diplomatic ally is one of their major tools for them to keep Taiwan out of the international society. And I think so. So I think maintaining diplomatic relations with our with the friendly countries is obviously most important. One of the most important diplomatic strategy of Taiwan, and I think. Another related issue for that is that they tend, aside from all the other economic tools and diplomatic pressures that they're putting on other friendly countries to switch recognition, I think recently we have observed another strategy, which is to apply Resolution 2758 and connect that with the switching of recognition. I think I think we first saw that in the Nauru case. I think they put the recognition of so-called Resolution 2758 and connect that with One China principle of Beijing and try to let them, let our diplomatic ally justify that there's only one China, and so you cannot engage with Taiwan. You can. I think we have rebutted this idea for a long time. I think that resolution, UNGA Resolution 2078, is not a resolution that that prohibits countries from engaging with Taiwan. It doesn't prohibit any country to maintain certain kind of relations, whether it's diplomatic or for our unofficial partners, their substantive relations with Taiwan. And so I think that that's a tool for them, by connecting the switch of recognition to Resolution 2078, they're also trying to use some legal tools and which will have other connotations when it comes to contingency around the Taiwan Strait. So I think that is something that we need to be very careful about, and that's something that we are trying to push back. So I think that's the first thing, the first set of ideas that we saw when PRC is trying to make efforts to get rid of our diplomatic allies. And I think the second set of ideas is for Latin America. I think Latin American countries, they're not very they're not they have their own ideas that they don't sometimes they are not thinking about the great power competition to some sort. And but I think Taiwan can offer a very good alternative for them. I think there are success stories with our assistance, but keeping Taiwan out of Latin America, keeping Taiwan out of Pacific Islands. I think for the regional countries, it's a loss for them. Because I think from our assistance, of course, we do not want to compete with PRC in terms of the amount of assistance, in terms of dollars. And I think we're not. I think our intention is not to compete with them in the amount, but I think we do, and we can offer a very good alternative, a very good option for their social and economic development. I think there was a former diplomat ally, a Taiwan diplomat ally, where we assist them in their rice production. I think in that country, they our technical mission in there in that country helped them establish the rice production, and now they are one of the major Latin American rice exporters. And I think there's another country where our technical mission helped them establish the shrimp industry, the shrimp farming. I think, and right now they're the most important. I mean, one of the most important item that they export is the shrimp. So I think with Taiwan's expertise, with Taiwan's economic knowledge, and of course, right now we should add the technological know-how. I think we can help, and together with other Latin American countries, I think we can offer more success stories for those countries that want a different route of development, a very different one from PRC, what PRC depicts. So I think keeping Taiwan out of Latin America and other regions is not a wise move for PRC. And together, we wanted to push back.
Thank you for that. I like the shrimp example. That's so very practical and concrete, and I know something that's welcome, around the region. Peter, if I can go back to you, Margaret mentioned that, and if you look at the Honduras case, for example, a lot of the promises haven't yet come to fruition. We've seen across the Belt and Road that sometimes there's a lot of promises that aren't necessarily delivered as expected. So, I mean, if you just look at Italy, clearly Italy had some buyer's remorse after signing the BRI, and they walked out and wanted to pursue their relationship with China kind of on their own terms. And in the report, one thing that Will has found in his research is that economic inducements generally work better and are stickier than just coercion and sticks. That, leaders are willing to do more to get those concrete economic benefits. And, as Gervasio mentioned, it's really hard to compete with China when it comes to concrete economic benefits. I don't know anybody who could be rolling out, multiple 100 million price tags, including the United States. So, from your perspective, how sustainable is this over the long term? Do you think that we could see it's interesting that Italy chose to leave the BRI. Some nations flipped their recognition to get Chinese economic inducements. Could we see some flipping back in the other direction? What do you think? How sticky do you think this is? And to what degree do you perceive Beijing deploying sticks at the same time to try to keep nations in line when the carrots turn out to be not as expected?
I think we've got three big questions there. The first is sort of the economic and financial stability of it. And I think, first and foremost, that depends on the PRC's economic health, the sense that they are moving forward, that they are growing. Right? This has been a major part of the PRC's narratives on a global scale of our rise is inevitable, you're best getting on board. And they have said the quiet part, which is, or else. They've put a banana embargo on the Philippines. We've had pineapple in Taiwan. We've had all sorts of little things that have been done that the signals have been sent. even if it's not as broad or as wide as the economic inducements. I think the PRC's economic health depends on a lot of things that everyone who follows China recognizes: a consumer economy and the like. But I think it's worth noting that they've made 3 big technology bets in AI, robotics, and advanced manufacturing. And that's really where the long-term health of the PRC economy is going to be driven. Like, these are historically novel bets. And if they succeed, then you're going to see an economy that is capable of sustaining this kind of growth and dynamism, and reinforcing the dependencies on PRC manufacturing or their largesse, and letting that manufacturing go to other countries, as industrialized economies have done. A second thing is that if they're not delivering on what was promised, then they're not really expending that much capital in the way that you would expect from the big ticket items, right? So that obviously would save them a lot of money to not actually pay the full freight. And then the third, I think, is how well can Beijing continue to leverage organizations like the World Bank or other developmental finance to kind of glide off of or coast off of Western capital and donations made by the United States, by Europe, by others in these institutions, and have them guided towards deliberate projects. And I think this is one of those things where, again, I think you, Melanie, among a couple of others, are really the only ones who have talked about international institutions and the need to rethink sort of the why and how we're engaged in them, rather than just sort of this top level, like, oh yes, we should be involved, right? It's the mechanics and the decision making of those organizations that's important. On the political sustainability of this effort, I think there's a question of, like, does it create backlash? Are there problems? And I think the question there is, are these deals highly partisan in nature, or is everyone on board? Are they a source of political conflict in the local system? And in some cases they are. In some cases they are, and it doesn't matter because the contracts have locked the country into this deal. And there's not really a clear alternative if they default on the debt or sort of get rid of the contracts. And that's where I think elements of the fear of coercion come in. Is, okay, if we start hurting PRC interests, if we start pulling out of these deals, what are those consequences? Not just the lack of future inducements, but what else could come? And third, on this, how are all of the tools working together? I think it's been a consistent PRC policy, going back to the opening with Japan, when Zhou Enlai, as premier and the head of the United Front Work Department, Liao Chengzhou, were discussing how do they get Japan to open to the PRC. It was a deliberate decision to push Tokyo away and cultivate the opportunities of prominent Japanese businesses that supported the LDP, to create this kind of domestic pressure on Japan to reach out on the PRC's own terms. And I think, as William cataloged in this study, there's a lot of efforts that seem to begin with, people-to-people consultations, cultural exchanges, trips of leaders, new business opportunities for local elites, not necessarily at the national government, but in provincial governments. And this is the kind of thing that's been seen in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, many other places where local government officials get cultivated because they have fewer resources to understand what is taking place. And, today's councilwoman is tomorrow's senator, or maybe a governor, or something else. And so I think we have to think of this as being bigger than just the individual incident. Because in the Solomon Islands case, I think this agreement on security and on port access that was signed with Beijing was a deal that had been disrupted, I think, around 10 times by Australia, by New Zealand, by the United States, before it finally went through. Nicaragua, I think, tried on a couple of occasions to switch recognition before the foreign minister went on a round the world trip to hide from the United States, from Taiwan, and others who might be aware that, yes, there are these specific instances where a shift happens, but we really ought to be looking at this longer term process underneath it, where you have business ties cultivated, you have the relationship with rising elite, with the ability to help them sort of win votes and gain influence, to have sort of more to spread around in terms of money, relationships, favors. And until we see that long-term process and see that as the piece to disrupt, then we're going to be stuck in this place where we continually deflect, but we don't really ever deny, and time is on Beijing's side.
That's a really great point. Many really great points, but I mean, my summary of what you just said is when you're seeing these choices being made about recognition and how, and to Gervasio's point, how to weigh in on Taiwan in at the UN and elsewhere as well, it's really a symptom of what's happening in the broader foreign influence space. And we should look at not just the symptom, but the playing field that's active and what's happening on the ground. That's such a really good point. Margaret, there's a question that's come in from the audience that I'm going to give to you. I think that this is from a Latin America anonymous comment, but I'm going to guess it's from the region. And here's the question. And my question to you is, how do you think about this and how to handle this, and what's your reaction? What, if anything, can Taiwan allies in Latin America and the Caribbean do to leverage their relationship with Taiwan to get preferential treatment from the US? This is when I was at the State Department, we would often get that question from countries that would say, values are nice, but I have people to feed. What can you offer me that comes anywhere near what China's putting on the table? And I'll nod with the values, but I'll put the cash in my bag every time. So and that's a hard thing. That's a hard road to navigate, because feeding people is important too. And nations have their own interests, and we want to be able to check both boxes, recognizing that between the United States and Taiwan, we don't do the bags of cash like Beijing does. So really welcome your thoughts on that one. It's an important question and a tricky one.
It is, and Melanie, frankly, I think you're the best one. You're the best equipped to answer it. But I'll offer some of my own thoughts. I think, there have been moments when, and I'm sure you were, you've known people who are integral in making a lot of this happen, when one wonders why, there is a lag at times in, in collaboration or support for or working together on, or however we want to frame it, between the US and Taiwan, trying to carry some of these things out in a collaborative manner in the Latin American context. And I'm thinking specifically of during the COVID-19, era, when Paraguay and others were asking for vaccines. They really needed them, and we're considering in that moment cutting ties with Taiwan and establishing with them with the PRC in order to be able to get vaccines quickly, and certainly Chinese officials, Chinese representatives were there making that case very strongly that that I believe they called it, what was it, either establish a diplomatic bridge or establish diplomatic relations in order to make this happen in a timely manner. And many were really considering that very seriously. And so there were moments, for example, in Paraguay, where the US did step in and support Taiwan and work together with Taiwan to provide not only I'm thinking back to the COVID-19 language, but PPE, right, and vaccines and other support. But there seemed to be a lag, right, in making that happen, and it was noted. It was noted by Taiwan allies. It was noted by others in the region, and so I don't know what the mechanisms are that are being used right now to ensure that level of collaboration and alignment of interests and generation of strategy, right? And especially in those countries that are currently allied with Taiwan, right? But certainly, speed is critical when you're talking about competing with China, with the PRC in the region. China is able to deliver things, I mean, across the board, whether we're talking about finance, whether we're talking about trade deals, whether we're talking about, new investments, or the delivery of assistance in various forms at a speed that very few can match. And so doing, really streamlining these processes and collaborating and coming up preemptively, right, with solutions to possible challenges down the road, I think is a something that really needs to be considered, if it is isn't already being considered. And, Melanie, truly, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on the matter, because I know you've been integrally involved in thinking about this, from within the government for a number of years, and your input would be, immensely valuable to this discussion.
So I'm going to make a plug, for the new administration. If anyone's watching, one of the favorite things that I worked on in the Biden administration was the US-Taiwan EPPD, the Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue. And if you look at the readout from the EPPD, that the meeting that occurred last October, I look at that as the dialogue where economics meets foreign policy in US-Taiwan relations. And if you look at the readout from the last EPPD, it does mention that the US and Taiwan, maybe for the first time, doing concrete economic projects together in third countries was an ambition going forward. So I know Senator Rubio is really a good champion on these issues. So I hope to see the State Department take that on and take it up a notch. It'd be interesting to see what the EPPD can help deliver with some of these third country partnerships. But I agree, speed is hard. And the only time I've seen the US government do well with speed is when you've done some pre-positioning and you're not starting from zero. But it's a really tough one. Pete, this question is really for you. This is a question that's come in from the audience, and it's about this question about United Front. The question is, does it make sense to compete with Beijing in their approach to United Front in blurring the official and personal ties with these countries? And would that even be possible given the constraints of liberal democracy? There are things that Beijing does that we don't do, that Taiwan doesn't do. The toolkit is just different. So since you mentioned this as such a critical layer of the challenge, the question is, does it make sense to try to compete given that the toolkits and constraints are different? Over to you.
So there are a few ways to look at that, because in some ways they're different, in some ways they're not. And when you look at the way the United States interacts with the world, often we're comparing the US government to the PRC government. Which government delivers which things? And yet that's not really the way the United States works, right? We create incentives, we create opportunities for US companies or for others, right? It's worth noting in the 5G fight, we were basically using American diplomatic muscle on behalf of a couple of big European companies, not simply for our own economic interests. And I think that this is an important point that I made when we testified together at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that the CCP is using these inducements to get people to serve Beijing's interests, whereas we provide our assistance from the United States because we are trying to help people stand up for their own countries, right? This was the Truman Doctrine. This is the way the Eisenhower administration works. This is the reason Ronald Reagan founded the National Endowment for Democracy, right? These are all about how do you help people stand up for their own interests, and that we can find a way to work with them from a sort of government to government standing and a people to people side. We also have large programs like Sister Cities, for example, that are about providing a sort of true experience of Americans and building some of these people to people connections. Right? The Smith-Mundt Act, that most people know only because of its limitations on State Department's use of propaganda, was really a bill or an act that authorized educational and cultural exchange, because the entire purpose of this was to provide a true experience of the United States. It was kind of like pre-bunking disinformation and KGB active measures before pre-bunking was really a word. Because if you think about, your high school biology teacher who happened to be an American, you'd be like, oh, well, the United States wouldn't do these things, right? Mrs. Johnson or Dr. Ames, because my great uncle was one of the people that participated in those programs in Libya, in Iran, elsewhere, right? They wouldn't do these things as Americans. So I think there's that element of it that where actually the United States competes quite well. And you can look at global attitude surveys and you can see how the US stacks up. Where we can be competing, and I think sort of, let's call it, tool on tool, if you will, with United Front, is that there is a built-in kind of corruption to these relationships. They are deliberately politicized as opposed to being a natural and organic relationship between two peoples, right? It's actually an effort to cut people off in their interaction with China to only dealing with the party rather than having a genuine interaction with Chinese people. So we have a tremendous capacity to expose the corruption that is sometimes embedded in these relationships. We have a tremendous capacity to bring transparency to the kinds of financial transactions that take place and the efforts to hide the relationship and the benefits. And that's really the first place, because especially for democratic and quasi-democratic countries, supporting those transparency tools is one of the key things. And transparency is active. It's not a passive piece. And when I think about all of the things that I've been involved in or that I've seen where the PRC's moves have been disrupted to sort of hive off these connections and cut out other sort of democratic relationships, it's always a combination of three things that makes a difference, that sort of makes transparency real. And the first is that you have expertise that is accessible to the people that are directly involved. That's something that the United States has. We have the largest China studies ecosystem in the world. And you can compare it to Europe, you can compare it to anywhere else. And it is really quite profound. Taiwan also has this. A second feature is some sort of connection to political power. You know, the ability to put pressure or to induce people to take beneficial actions. And then the third is some sort of insider, whistleblower, if you will, who's willing to take a risk to expose what is taking place inside a country, inside an institution, to that expertise, to that political power, so that something can be done. These are all areas where the United States has a lot of different tools, and also has a lot of different tools for empowering locals to stand up for what they believe in and for the integrity of their own system.
That's incredibly helpful. You know, Gervasio, I'm going to go to you, and my top line question is what can and should the U.S. do to help? I'll also share, we have a question that came in online that says, how will the U.S. relationship with China and Taiwan potentially change under President Trump? What is Taiwan doing to prepare, to engage the new administration? I will share, for folks who aren't in DC and aren't aware, this is really early days. At the State Department, for example, I mentioned that the EPPD was one of our core dialogues for engaging Taiwan. That's led by the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, and that person has been nominated but hasn't had their Senate hearing. They're not in the seat. So a lot of the people who would lead on Taiwan policy out of the agencies are just not yet confirmed yet. That's a challenge with the US system, that it takes a while. So it's still very early days. And some of those official to official structures that are so critical for US policy towards Taiwan and everyone are still in development because we just don't have the full team in yet. But given that, what should the US, from your perspective, what would be the best outcome of the Trump administration when it comes to addressing this issue? What should the U.S. be doing? I think clearly we heard from Rep. Krishnamurthy, Congress is on it. Congress is very enthusiastic about being supportive. That doesn't always transfer perfectly to the executive branch. So just welcome your thoughts. What do you want to see out of the executive branch? What do you see so far? What should the U.S. be doing from Taiwan's view?
Thanks so much. I think, first of all, I wanted to go back a little bit to the previous question about the leverage, and from our perspective, I don't see that as a I think we don't have to think from the leverage side. I think we have to think from another angle of cooperation. I think U.S. and Taiwan on third country cooperation is getting closer. The relationship and the collaboration is getting closer and closer. I think I think one example of that is we signed an MOU, on foreign assistance cooperation with Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, one of the main Development Assistance Agency of the United States. We signed an MOU with them in 2024. And I think that has opened up a wider range of possibilities for collaboration between United States and Taiwan on helping developing countries. A lot of countries in Latin America who are eager to find their own way of and not accepting PRC's way. Another alternative that goes back to my previous point on Taiwan, of course, together with the United States and other like-minded countries, offering another alternative for regional countries to find social and economic development. I think we are a very good example of finding on our proper routes for economic development. So I think that's one way that we in the United States can do. I think we are encouraged to continue that conversation with the current administration. I think the current administration is we sense a very strong willingness of the current administration to continue this kind of dialogue and conversation. And I think another way of doing that is also voice more publicly the support of maybe from the United States side or from the like-minded countries side. Voicing support of for those countries in the region to maintain their diplomatic ties with Taiwan, or even developing new engagement with Taiwan. I think there are two recent examples of that support, which are very public. The first one being Secretary Rubio visiting his first visit to Latin America, especially in Guatemala. He voiced very openly the support, both in Spanish and in English, praising Guatemala's efforts to maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, encouraging Taiwan and Guatemala, and of course, United States to cooperate. So I think that's the first example of strong voice of support. The second, very recent example of support, speaking out loud in support of Taiwan's diplomatic relations with Belize. I think if you can check State Department's opening, open statement on congratulation of their congressional election. I think at the last paragraph, it stated that they, United States also appreciate Belize maintaining relations, with Taiwan, with democratic Taiwan. So I think those are the open voices of the current administration in support of Taiwan's maintaining diplomatic relations with all our remaining diplomatic partners. So I think once again, we're not, of course, we're hopeful that we can continue discussing and exploring opportunities of cooperation with the United States and third countries, especially in our diplomatic allies. But I also want to say that we will do everything we can within our own capacity to help our diplomatic allies in various ways. I think we can transition from agricultural assistance and public health. I think recently Foreign Minister Lin Jialong, he just said publicly announced that we're going to integrate AI into our agriculture, and bring the technology and assistance to our diplomatic allies. So I think there are innovative ways that we ourselves as Taiwanese can do to help our diplomatic allies grow and prosper. And I think that's Minister Lin's goal of bringing prosperity to our diplomatic allies so that we can continue strengthening their relations, not in competition as dollar amounts with PRC, because that's not the way, that's not the route that we are going to move towards.
Thank you for that. I think the partnership between DFC and Taiwan's development bank is really exciting. I've been really proud to see what DFC has done in partnership with Japan and Australia. You know, they've found that when you join forces, you can do great development projects that might be hard for any of us to do alone. So I look forward to seeing what comes from that. That's quite new and exciting. We only have 4 minutes left, so I'll start with Margaret and then Peter and Gervasio, and just give each of you the opportunity to share any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, as we wrap up this really terrific discussion. So Margaret, over to you, and then Peter, and then Gervasio.
Well, thanks again, Melly. No, I mean, just very quickly, I think I'll just underscore a point that, that Peter's already made so beautifully, but that's, when we think about China's engagement, and I think when the Latin American region thinks about China's engagement, they think big infrastructure, right? And that may or may not be what China is doing in the coming years. But as we all know, and there are so many different definitions of the Belt and Road Initiative and so many different manifestations of Chinese engagement in Latin America and other places, when we think about really what's happening, we're talking infrastructure, we're talking about trade connectivity, we're talking about financial integration, we're talking about policy coordination in its various forms, right? And we're talking about people-to-people connectivity. And just as Peter mentioned, this is how so much of this happens. This is how, yes, there are big promises that are being made, but those networks are being developed very, very early on, 10 years in advance, 20 years sometimes in advance of a decision, either to pursue a certain project or to pursue a certain decision, vis-a-vis Taiwan. And that's actually a strength, right? One of our strengths, historically, especially in Latin America, has been our people-to-people connections, right? Our vast network of contacts, of cultural outreach. It's something that I hope we'll continue to prioritize well into the future with lots of funding and lots of support, because it has carried us so far and will be absolutely fundamental in ensuring that we're able to compete effectively with China on wide-ranging measures.
So I think
Over
what
to
I
you.
would I think what I would conclude with is simply that a study like this is incredibly useful for highlighting the way in which a lot of different elements of Beijing statecraft are integrated. And if I were to pick on the China watching community for the thing that bothers me the most, it is simply that we have done an incredibly terrible job of understanding Beijing statecraft, of understanding the party's statecraft, and all of the ways in which it integrates those tools together. We've had these isolated verticals. We study foreign policy in an isolated way without understanding the party's domestic ambitions, how they feed in globally. And we need more work like this study and others so that those of us that are thinking about this in the civil society perspective, because we're not in government, and those of us who will go into government or are serving in government, have tools that help us frame what it is the PRC is doing. And so that we're actually taking measures that support our friends, our allies, our partners, frankly, the well-being of people. Because if you look at who has suffered the most from the Chinese Communist Party, it has been Chinese people, and it has been those whose governments have kind of come under and fallen in line. So I think there's a national interest, there's a human interest that we have in this kind of understanding and ensuring that we actually have an adequate response to these tools.
Thank you. Over to you, Gervasio.
Thank you so much. I would offer very, very shortly, in conclusion, that, the fact that PRC is trying everything that they can to lure our diplomatic allies from, to switch recognition. Of course, it's our question. Of course, it's Taiwan. We have to think about ways that we can, continue strengthening our relations with our diplomatic allies so that they will not be lured, and so that they understand the benefits and the substantive cooperation that they can have when they keep diplomatic relations with us. But there's another set of issues that we have to think more broadly, which is, it will become the switching of recognition will become a regional question that all the like-minded countries, including United States, including other, like-minded, will have to face the challenges that we'll face. Like, for example, I think what Peter just, in the beginning mentioned about the Solomon Islands. I think in 2019, after switching recognition, I think there are a lot of other problems that come out of that switch recognition that becomes regional challenges that all United States and other like-minded countries has to face. And I think if we were still there, we would do everything we can to keep that relationship. And I think that's also beneficial to the United States and other like-minded countries. So I think inclusion, we will do our utmost within our capacity to strengthen our relations. But of course, we will also appreciate the cooperation, of course, with the United States, with other like-minded countries. If they can continue voicing their support of our diplomatic relations, I think the more we'll get from it. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Peter, Margaret, and Gervasio. This is a tremendous amount of expertise on one panel, and I really enjoyed the discussion with you all. And congratulations to William Picos for a truly fabulous contribution to the China Studies body of work. The depth, the detail, to Peter's point, the way that the report shows not just one silo, but case by case, the different pieces of influence that are operating together to sway countries' decisions is really a great contribution. And I'm glad that he's now over at the U.S. Congress and the Congressional Research Service, bringing that expertise where it is much needed. So thank you all for joining this conversation, and thanks to the audience for joining us. Important topic, and glad to be discussing it with you all.